Hello everybody and welcome back to another Wainrider Wednesday, the weekly series where we look at progress on the upcoming mod for Rome Total War's Alexander expansion, Total War Wainriders, set in the Third Age of Middle-earth before the events of the War of the Ring, during a time of great upheaval and invasion across the known world. And today we are keeping our focus in the north with the faction of the Orcish Tribes, sometimes referred to as the Orcs of the Misty Mountains, or just the Orcish Tribes. I am really happy to see a purely Orcish faction. I say purely, they're going to have a few other non-Orcish elements, even some Mannish representation, depending on how you conquer and how you develop your non-Orcish provinces. Some of that is discussed in the battle preview video for this faction, so take a look at that, as well as all of the other previews on the channel if you're interested to see what else we've been up to. The Orcs of the Misty Mountains are, of course, clustered along the Misty Mountains here, but they do have some territory in the Grey Mountains, which seems very fitting. So this is a faction that is, you might say, expanding. The Orcs of this period are kind of at an interesting point in their history. Sauron, at the moment, is, of course, not in Mordor. He is located around Dol Guldur, although I don't believe it's quite clear, to other people in the world exactly what he's doing, or even where precisely he is. Now, at some points, orcs are referred to as Sauron's people. There's a reference in, I believe it's Appendix B, where Sauron is said to have peopled the Misty Mountains with his creatures. So given that, you might suppose that maybe the orcs should be slaves to Sauron, they should only be his servants, they should be part of a faction that answers to Sauron. I think, however, that would be a misreading of what few hints we get about orcish society. For example, famously in the Two Towers, we can see how there are orcs from several different factions present, where Merry and Pippin are being transported across Rohan, and there is great violence breaking out even within Mordor itself among the various orcish factions there. So to suppose an orcish faction that is more or less independent, albeit maybe allied with another evil faction like Angmar, as this one is, seems fairly reasonable. In other words, you as the orcs can decide how you're going to expand, at whose expense you are going to expand to a great degree. And while you will have some initial wars and even an alliance set up, you are not necessarily beholden to that. You can be your own orc, as it were. Now again, the preview here should be considered something of a work in progress. For example, we have the difficulty factor for this faction listed as decidedly Tookish, which translates to, I believe, medium, indicating that this is going to be one of the easier factions in the mod to play. I'm honestly not sure. I have no idea how that's going to work out, because the orcs, of course, will have a very different way of interacting with various populations than any, say, Mannish faction. They won't be able to make the same use of newly conquered territories in the same way that Arnor would or the Eotheod would, and so there's going to be some population difficulties you'll have to work around. On the other hand, your units will be fairly cheap and fairly large in size, and that tends to translate quite well onto the battlefield if you use them well. Don't underestimate hordes of decent units. You're not going to have superior, fantastic stuff, but you may have plenty to do a lot of damage. The question I have is, how is that going to translate on the campaign map? In terms of lasting gains. Can you sustain it, or are you going to be sort of a flash in the pan, good early rush faction, but without a lot of staying power? Well, with those considerations in mind, let's take a look at the text we've written to introduce the faction, and then jump into the campaign map to see how you are disposed around those mountain passes and river crossings we've talked about in the past few episodes. And I do want to say that, again, Valor has done some great work with the unit cards, and this one in particular is fantastic. Of course, we've got a hill troll here dangling a hapless dwarf by his toe. So, on to the intro text. The Misty Mountains were raised as a wall, some say, by the power of Melkor in the days of the world's youth, in order to hinder the riding of Orome. The mountains are more than a physical barrier. Their sides are scored with caves and tunnel entrances, and at their roots nameless things wallow in the dark. Orc folk have long dwelt here, tribe vying with tribe, chief against chief in a brutal struggle for dominance. But with the rise of new powers in the north, the Witch King in Angmar, the shadow settling upon Dol Guldur, the tribes have begun to unite and to multiply. Joining with others of their kin in the Grey Mountains and making pacts with the realm of Angmar, they look now to spend their new strength. For centuries now have they harried the dwarves, who once laid claim to the eastern slopes and caverns of these mountains. Now the people of Durin hide themselves in their ancestral halls, bereft of allies. Only Moria itself remains in their possession, a city and stronghold so far impenetrable to the orc hordes. Many of the tribes are eager to try their strength elsewhere, to sweep into the lowlands to loot and burn. Their warriors are swift and cunning, hardened by raids against the dwarves and goaded by chiefs greedy for riches. But some aspire to more than plunder. The mightiest orc chieftains, inflamed by some dark urging, aim at conquest to bring ruin and terror to the proud dwarf realms and the faltering rule of men. Now, I've got to say, that gets me in the mood to play the orcs. I am really looking forward to this faction. I really like playing good guy factions too, but there is something about playing an orc faction in a mannish world that just seems like it's going to be a lot of fun. And there's a lot of targets. As you can see, you're in a very target-rich environment up here in the north. Commanding the mountains, you have access not only to the eastern side, to the Anduin Vale, to Mirkwood, to the realm of Thranduil, which is right on your doorstep. You can get over towards the League of the North, get towards Dale, or at least the territory around what would later be known as Dale, certainly the Lonely Mountain, the Iron Hills, exploit the riches in these hills, maybe even move farther into the east. You can also go into the west, on the western side of the mountains, snipe some territory from under the nose of your ally Angmar before they're able to get total control of it, and of course head south to Khazad-dûm. So let's jump into the campaign map to see how this all looks in practice. The Orcish campaign starts you off centered at your capital, which initially is Gundabad, of course. Gundabad itself, a very good capital, both, of course, in terms of lore and also just in terms of strategy. You own a couple of other settlements to your south and one over to your east. So Gundabad is about as central as you're going to get, making it good in terms of minimizing those mismanagement penalties and public order penalties. But one thing to really keep in mind as we're looking at this faction and as you're sort of plotting your Orcish conquest is that the map has been made to help facilitate travel not only across the mountains but along the length of the mountains. You may remember from another preview video looking at the Wainriders map, I think it was called Across the Misty Mountains, where I showed how a dwarf army starting in Khazad-dûm might march northward both along the flanks of the Misty Mountains and over some of the new passes that we've added. And one of your Orcish settlements here, Torog, actually commands one of those slightly new paths. In 4th Age Total War, we had this river originating in the Misty Mountains, of course, and proceeding down. I guess this is the extreme Grey Flood, the origin of the Grey Flood? Regardless, there were no crossings over this river. However, on this map, you can get around the northern or the I guess the source of the river here. It's not so much a crossing, but just a way you can get around the river that takes you down relatively easily towards the High Pass, and of course Rivendell, which is also a little bit more easily accessible thanks to the addition of this river crossing. So we have a pass here. The High Pass is of course one of the main ones, and you start off with a province that also doesn't exactly command the High Pass. It doesn't exert any zone of control issues, but it certainly puts you in a fantastic position to build, like, say, a temporary camp, like a fort here, or just have an army somewhere to essentially block travel along the pass. You may also try some ambushes because your territory goes down along into the foothills, not only in the pass itself, but down along the mountains. So there's a few trees here for you to work some ambushes. And this territory does have a border with the Gladden Heights region, which is also connected to one of our new passes over the mountains, right around here. And not far from that is Khazad-dûm. So if you think about it, you're only a few settlements away from the dwarves, from one of your major enemies, and certainly a major goal of the Orcish campaign. That you could get at within a few conquests, mostly by traveling along the eastern side of the Misty Mountains. But if you're more interested in dealing with the elves first, they are really rather accessible to you. And Rivendell is looking very vulnerable indeed to an Orcish sack if you can pull it off. Now again, we haven't set up the initial disposition of the factions in terms of their starting armies, and all of those can vary depending on the faction that you have selected to play. So if you are playing as the orcs, we'll probably beef up the AI presence at Rivendell just to make it not so easy for you to just slaughter Elrond, but that may be a worthy goal because as you can tell, there is a bit of contested territory around here. We've got Eastern Rudour, which is in the possession of your ally Angmar, and just south of that, we've got the Valley of Imladris. So you can't really go from your territory in the Ettindales to your territory along the High Pass and the foothills on the eastern side without crossing over someone's territory, be that Angmar or the Elves. So there's a lot of factions coming together, particularly around here. Of course, though, Angmar and the Elves are not the only factions you'll have to worry about in your neighborhood. You also have the Aotheod, a new-come Northman faction. And honestly, I think these guys may be one of your largest threats. The Aotheod have, I believe, just 2 settlements initially. We just did a preview for them. So they've got a couple of settlements right in the river, right near to your own starting position. And as a mannish faction with some good cav, and probably a decent number of units, at least when you're playing as the Orcs, they could pose a significant threat. So as you start to expand, they will be expanding as well, probably into the very territories you're interested in taking, and then conflict is going to become inevitable. So an early move against the Aotheod is probably going to be, in some ways, a bigger deal than the Elves, because the Elves only have Rivendell right here, and Lorien down here, as well as another settlement adjacent to it. But Rivendell's rather exposed and rather isolated, whereas the Aotheod are sort of a younger faction with greater population growth and the capability, the possibility of raising large and intimidating armies. But given that you've got only one settlement on the eastern flank here, probably a good early move might be to take out some of these rebel settlements in the area, like Thambrig, or maybe the settlement to the south. But regardless of what you do, unless you betray your ally of Angmar, you're going to be sort of strung out as a faction. You know, the Orcs present sort of an interesting problem in that their factions are rather linear. So you don't have depth exactly, unless a faction is facing you, on the end of that line, like, say, the Dwarves would be. But the Aotheod, I just feel rather vulnerable here with just a single settlement on the eastern side and then the closest neighbor on the western side of the mountains. As for the north, though, Gundabad, of course, commands one of the crossings into Angmar's territory, both west and east. And the difficulty with that is that there may be some problems between you and your ally. Of course, you'll both be set up with military access, I would imagine, at the beginning of the campaign, so that you won't be blocking one another. But there's probably going to be a lot of traffic in here, and it wouldn't surprise me if it came to blows sooner or later between you and your ally, the Witch King. Of course, the Witch King is not the kind of leader who's going to want to allow an independent, rising, powerful confederation of Orcish tribes to just coalesce on his doorstep, and so it would certainly make sense if he turned on you sooner rather than later. So it might make sense then for you to just sort of hold off for a little while, watch how the war is unfolding in the west, see if you can take some opportunities as they arise, and then maybe one of those opportunities might be to backstab Angmar. Certainly that would help regularize some of your borders. Of course, there are some settlements here and here that are in Angmar's possession that would be really nice to have for you just to sort of round out your territory. And then you may progress over towards Mount Graham and then possibly even Carn Dûm, or maybe just go on a merry sack and raid through Eriador. But as for the Grey Mountains, your presence is limited to this one settlement here. However, there are several other rebel settlements in the area that you might be able to make good use of, certainly better than some of the Mannish or Elven settlements that you might conquer in the lowlands, let's say. So as the Orcs, you're going to want to look for these mountain-type places, make them your own, and then start training your own stuff if you can. In terms of the borderlands of the arid Mithrin Fells, this is your province, and you'll notice that it allows you to get right to this crossing here along eastern Angmar. So again, if Angmar is causing trouble for you, this would be an easy, vulnerable early grab, or maybe you could just wait for the Aotheod to take it, if they do, and then take it from them without starting a war with your ally quite so early. But you'll notice that you do actually border the Elves from turn 1. So this is one of, I believe, 2 settlements that Thranduil begins with. One of them, of course, is the Elven King's Halls, right about here, and the other one I think is right up here, not too far from it. And so you can, theoretically, access his land very early, but I would be somewhat hesitant to do that. Again, for the same reason that I'm a little concerned about this one settlement near the Aothiad. Urug is your farthest settlement from any other settlement. And to reinforce it, you'll need to move through, potentially through Angmar's territory. So there is a bit of logistics issues sometimes playing as the orcs. However, we have done our best to make some new passes available through some of this territory around Gundabad, so you don't quite have to march through Angmar's territory all the time. You could, for example, take this settlement, what is this, Ogal, fairly early, and then proceed down through the passes to link up some of your territories. That might be a good early move, and then head over towards the Withered Heath and then the Lonely Mountain. But yeah, you're going to have lots of different fronts, lots of different regions that you'll be facing at very kind of far-flung borders. And the thing is, you'll probably start the game at war with all of your neighbors except one. And that's going to make life rather difficult. So again, that decidedly Tookish rating in terms of the difficulty, I'm not too sure how that's going to play out. One other thing I should mention is that, of course, this is the first time we are seeing the Orcish UI that Valor has constructed for this faction. Of course, one of the challenges with the Orc faction and the reason that they're sort of hard to do is that they make for a lot of extra work. It wouldn't make sense to just have the same old sort of Mannish or Dwarven UI. You have to create really an entirely new culture for them and then sort of set that stuff up separately. So that's what we've got here. We've got the new sort of icons for building things, for recruiting things, and so that is also going to be the case at various other places around the campaign and battle UI. As for victory conditions for the orcs, we haven't quite settled on those, I don't believe, but certainly heading down to Khazad Dûm would be a big one, possibly taking more territory in the Grey Mountains, possibly Mount Graham. Not quite sure exactly what we're going to want to have them get as of yet. But whatever they are, I'm very much looking forward to these guys. It'll be really interesting to play a faction made up of orcs for orcs, right? Instead of seeing them as merely the lackeys of some other larger faction, here we get the chance to see them on their own, so to speak. Maybe doing some of their own will for a change. Of course, in that intro text, we had the hint that there was some dark urging provided by the impetus of Sauron, no doubt, and certainly the other larger players, such as the Witch King, are going to want to use the orcs as an end or as a tool for their own purposes. But I think the more interesting campaign for the orcs, at least in my view, would be to see what they can do as their own, not as one of Sauron's lackeys, but as a burgeoning faction in their own right. Can they conquer territory? Can they hold territory from these rather humble beginnings and make a real go of it? It'll certainly be a challenge with just about everybody in Middle-earth ranged against you, but it'll be fun to see how far you can go. So I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Orcish faction. Just, I think, 2 more left. Next time we are going to head over to a long-requested fan favorite. This is Arnor. We're going to see how their campaign prospects look. And then it'll be over towards Great Rune, the final Wainrider faction. And then we start looking at other things. So as always, stay tuned to the channel for future updates. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or suggestions about anything to do with the mod, and I'll do my best to answer those. But until the next one, everybody, take care.